The end product's impressive. It's really good. I've enjoyed listening. I've been sitting on my bike trainer the last
Oh, is
week
that
or
where you?
so.
Yeah.
So just listening has been good.
Hello, Harry here, and welcome back to another episode of Jog On. This and other podcast episodes are also available in video format. You can go to the YouTube channel Jog On Podcast with Harry Morgan. Today's episode is with a special guest called Brian Murray. We spoke about Brian's background in running.
You know, you just want to go further and further.
From running 3 marathons in the 80s through to his transition to the bike.
And most people could do it, I think.
Brian has done some absolutely incredible bike races, including the Transamerican bike race.
If you turn up at these events, that's where you get the respect. It doesn't really matter what your time is.
Cycling the entire distance across America.
So they're all talking. You walk in, everybody looks, thinks, who's that?
We spoke both about the ups.
If this is all I experience, I'm happy.
And the downs of this experience.
And I just went down with a thump.
He's a fascinating personality, and it was an absolute pleasure to speak with him.
As a firefighter, I have seen some things that perhaps people shouldn't see,
So please, welcome to Jog On, Brian Murray.
When I was with the fire service, I was obviously up in Scotland and I moved down to Warwickshire. And this is back in 1986. And I went to an incident and it was a road accident. And we were busy helping get this chap out the car. He was in a really bad way. So the ambulance were working on him. We were trying to cut him out. But in the background, the police were trying to round up all these cows because it was a truck that was carrying cows and they were all over the motorway.
Wow.
I remember getting interviewed on the radio. So I had this horrendous Scottish accent. We didn't know if his family had been told he was involved. So I was having to be really careful about what I was saying. But then I started laughing about these cows and I was just thinking, oh dear, what a bad radio interview. But fortunately, by the time it appeared on the radio, everything was nice and slick and smooth. So
they'd smoothed it out.
Yeah. But I was dreading that interview appearing.
Really, I'd like to just ask you about, take you back 40 years really to the 80s, and you talk about you were fairly keen in football, but you also ran on the side to complement the football a bit. Did you run for the enjoyment of running, or was running seen as something that was just there to help your football and your fitness?
I've always enjoyed running. So even at school, I always ran. And I ran because I enjoyed it. And then later on, I would run to work. I would run to football training. And I didn't do it because I didn't have a car. I would do it because I actually enjoyed the experience of running. I like that feeling of being outside and things like bad weather. When you're out running in it, it doesn't matter. It's just part of the experience. So I did really enjoy running.
Yeah.
And I listened to one of your other podcasts when you were talking about what makes a runner. And I would never have classed myself as a runner, but I did. I ran a lot, so I enjoyed it. So I've always enjoyed running, but eventually it caught up with me just with some injuries.
Yeah, so when was that? Was that sort of as you were turning 40, around that kind of age?
Yes, as I moved into my 40s, I started to, I suppose, footballing injuries and various other things, but my Achilles tendon used to trouble me. So once I got over about 30 minutes running, it would start to ache and throb. So it was never bad enough to stop me running, but it was annoying because I couldn't do the distances that I used to enjoy doing. And I tried hard. I used to do exercises. I used to put a bag of cement in my rucksack and do heel lifts on the stairs to try and build it up, but I just couldn't escape it. And then I would stop running for months on end to see if it would recover, build it back up slowly, but it just kept coming back. So in many ways, I was fit and healthy. It's just that I couldn't run long distance. So I had to accept it. And that's where the cycling started to creep in more and more, because I do like the long distance side of things. I like to be out. I like to be out on my own. I like to be out in the country, out, you know, in the adverse weather. I actually enjoy it.
And when you discovered cycling, did you find that you had a bit of a natural ability at it, to kind of like the running? You had a good cardiovascular system on you to convert to decent cycling?
That's an interesting question. I've always been fit, and I've always taken it kind of for granted that I could do most sports. But with cycling, I don't actually think I'm that a good cyclist. I'm just I'm an ordinary cyclist. The only thing that makes my cycling different is that I could be an ordinary cyclist for quite a long time. So I could cover quite big distances. But I love cycling, but I'm not particularly good at it in terms of speed, but I can keep going.
Yeah, it's interesting that I was going to ask you a little bit more about that you covered the idea of moving further, covering greater distances. This is something I've explored with a couple of people who've been on, and I've talked to about people in the past. There is something quite almost meditative about going for those really long endurance runs. You mentioned that you'd listened to the recent episode with Carla, who ran Land's End to John O'Groats, and you can tell that her passion lies in multi-day stuff, almost like a marathon isn't enough anymore. And do you think for you there was an element of a mental side that attracted you to it, that ability to keep going, and that there's just something quite interesting in testing your own limits with those kind of distances? Did you find that?
I love the challenge, and I do like to push myself further and further, but in some ways it's actually a bit of a flaw.
Right.
In as much as I'll run a distance, and then once I'm comfortable running that distance, I'll think, oh, maybe I could go further. And I seem to just keep, you just want to go further and further. So I could totally understand people getting into multi-day events. And even at the moment, I'm starting to get back into jogging. But my family are restricting me to 5K because they know me so well that once I've done 5K, I'll start thinking, I wonder if I could do 10. And before I know it, I'll be trying to plod miles and miles. I'm not going to do that, though. I'm sticking to the cycling. It's good for me.
Yeah. So the cycling itself, obviously that started to progress. You start out cycling and then, like, the usual sort of Brian Murray pattern, you might argue, the distance starts to build and you move on to doing quite longer distances. One in particular, you did Le Jog. There's more than just the cycling at that point. It's about supporting yourself and it's about working out your nutrition and accommodation. The Le Jog, when you cycled it took you 6 days. Was that arguably perhaps the first time you did an event where it really confirmed for you that the Transamerican bike race might be doable? That
was certainly the point that I thought it was doable. Prior to Le Jog, I had done a couple of sportives in Wales, up in Snowdonia, that were about 225 miles in that region. So I knew I could do long distance. And the Le Jog I just thought, I'm going to try it and see if I could do 150 miles each day, because doing it one day is relatively easy, but could I keep it going? I was pleasantly surprised that it didn't get any more difficult to do the 150 miles. But there is a lot goes round about it, about as you say, about the nutrition starts to come into it. Things like preventing injury, because if you've got the slightest difficulty with your bike, if the setup's not quite right, you might get away with that one day, but you can't do it day after day. So that was a great experience, Le Jog. And one of the things I would say, it was a real pleasant surprise, the experience of cycling from Land's End to John O'Groats through the UK. I had expected it to be just a training cycle. I was doing it to get the miles in. But it was awesome. It's spectacular, and I would highly recommend it. And I know people run it, but it was a great experience just to do that. And yet I hadn't expected that. It took me by surprise. So it was a good learning experience that confirmed to me that the Transamerican bike race, in terms of completing the distance, I could actually do it. Yes.
On Le Jog itself, did you have your accommodation planned out for each of your stops? Had you broken it down 6 days, or did you just see where you got to and then work it out from there?
I had it more or less planned because I was aiming for 150 miles. Like, day one was simple, Land's End to Exeter, so that I could stay in my own bed. And then I had the stages planned out.
I wanted to talk to you about the decision to do the Transamerican bike race. You mentioned that you'd actually seen a documentary originally about cycling across America that possibly planted the seed of the idea. What was that moment, and what was the thing that led up to you finally going, I think I'm going to go for this?
Well, what happened, the documentary I watched was about Race Across America. And it's a totally different race. It's the same concept. The cyclist starts on one side of America, gets to the other side, but they have teams with them. So they have two support cars, one behind the bike, should I say, and one leapfrogs and prepares the meals. They've got the medics with them. So it's very much, in many ways, the cyclist goes harder because they've got the medical support. But in other ways, it's easier because they don't have to think about anything. But it was the documentary, the things that stuck with me is one of the riders got a problem called Shermer's neck that happens in long distance cycling. Neck muscles just totally stop working. They just say, I've had enough. So the neck, the head falls forward because the head's quite heavy. And in this documentary, they showed that what they did was they got some plastic plumbing pipe and built a rig to hold this chap's head up. And in a strange way, I just loved the determination and the commitment to actually complete. And I thought, that appeals to me a lot. So then I started to look into it. I went to a seminar in London about it. But once I found out about the extent of the logistics that you have to have in place, I realized it wasn't for me. However, at that event, I spoke to a chap that was actually doing the very first transamerican bike race. And that was it. The seed was planted. So I started to look into it. I started to follow it online when they were actually racing. And then over the years, and it took me a number of years, just to gently build up until I was at the point that I was confident I could do it, and I entered. And the thing about the confidence to do it isn't so much the confidence to do it, but the confidence to turn up at the start line with this huge event in front of you. But it was that documentary that sowed the seed, and then a lot of hard work in between to get to that standard.
You talked about when you went down to that event that you worked out that particular style of racing across America wasn't for you. What about it wasn't for you in the end? Was it the slight lack of adventure that you're having so much help, or was it just the sheer expense financially of getting all that sorted?
The sheer expense was certainly a factor, but you have to have a huge team that sits behind you, and it does take away a bit of the... For me, it takes away... Like, I want to stretch myself to the limit. And with that, you had all the support. So I think you put it very concisely there. It does take away a bit of the adventure of what I was looking for. Whereas when I heard about the Trans Am, I thought, so you've got to look after yourself. So you've got to carry everything with you. Everything's on the bike. It just sounded better and better. Everything I heard about it, which was actually making it more and more difficult, actually sounded better and better to me and more appealing. So that was the direction I went.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can absolutely see that slightly different style, and it does have that ring of adventure to it, and it feels a little more, possibly a little more natural, if that's a way of putting it, a little less man-made and constructed. It's just you, your own power, and just you as the solo individual, and there's something quite pleasant about that, I would imagine. And it's certainly feeding that desire of yours, and for many people who love long-distance stuff, to really just escape for a while and be on their own. I mean, obviously for you, 22 days of escape is a long time. But the interesting thing, as I read you'd written about, was this idea of all the people you met, and what seems like such a lonely endeavour actually turns out to be one of the most sociable experiences of your life, because you end up meeting all these incredible people. Just before we got on to what happened, just so I'm keeping it fairly chronological, Brian, I wanted to just talk to you about, in the build-up, you had a few issues. In particular, you had a couple of crashes, if you don't mind talking about those. One particularly bad, one with a breaking of the pelvis. Could you just talk me through how they happened, and whether you thought that the Transamerican bike race was in jeopardy, whether it would actually take place?
What happened was I had just joined the fire service, the retained fire service in Exeter, and I had to be on call for certain amounts of time. So I would cycle locally so that I could get to the fire station within 5 minutes if there was an incident. And so this day I was cycling up at the local university, and as I started to come down a hill, there were double speed bumps that were quite vicious. However, I'd cycled over them times before, but on this particular day, I was caught unawares for whatever reason, and I just went down with a thump, and I could just remember lying there thinking, oh, that was really painful. One of the security guards from the university came out, called an ambulance and what have you, and I was lying there, and she was talking to me, and I'm saying, it's okay. I think I'm just winded. I will be okay.
Wow.
However, the ambulance turned up, And they eventually get me into the back of the ambulance. And they're saying, would you like any pain relief? And I'm saying, no, I think I'm okay. I'm just winded. I just need to get my breath back. But little did I know, my bone was sticking through my elbow. I'd completely shattered my elbow and the bone was sticking out. So I was saying to them, if you think I need pain relief, I'll take it. I'm not objecting to it. The power of adrenaline is just incredible, because later on when I saw my elbow, when I actually looked, I thought, oh dear, and I had broken my pelvis. However, what happened is then NHS were brilliant. So I get back on my bike very quickly. 6 months later, I'm still in the fire service, still having to stay close to the fire station. I'm cycling on a different part of the university grounds, and I slipped on leaves and the bike just went from under me. Wow. Never having had accidents before, suddenly 2 within 6 months. And again, adrenaline kicked in. So I managed to get myself up on my feet. And I could remember thinking, I can't have done it again. I just can't have damaged myself so badly. What I always thought was funny is, as students came down the path towards me, I'd stand up straight with my bike and say, morning, morning. And as soon as they were past, I was bent double over the thing. But I got myself to the roadway. Getting into the car was agony because I had broken my hip. So unfortunately, I did it twice. So this all happened between one of my long sportives and the other. So within a year, I was back on the bike, able to cycle 220 miles. So I have to be grateful for the superb efforts of the NHS and just for the healing capabilities of my body. So it turned out quite positive. And when I did that second sportive, it was just a relief that I could do the distance. So I knew that my plans for this big event weren't destroyed.
No, it could still go ahead.
Yeah.
So you head out to America to begin the Transamerican bike race. Looking back now, do you think that there was an element of just almost obliviousness to what you're about to endure? Because it's quite hard to comprehend the idea of, I'm about to be cycling for the best part of a month across an entire country. Do you think that it is just, you mentioned about the bravery just gets you to the start line. The bravery isn't needed for the whole thing. The bravery is just needed just to get you there, and then you see what happens. So looking back, do you think there was an element of you just kind of thinking about just getting the first few days out the way and that's it?
I was incredibly naive. I had done quite a lot of research, so I had a feel for it, but I was incredibly naive. You know, there was lots I learned in the first few days, that the enormity of it, which just made it better, actually. It's actually quite a nice, perhaps if I hadn't been so naive, maybe I wouldn't have got to the start line.
Possibly, yeah. So you start off and you actually end up cycling quite a long distance before you even take your first real overnight sleep, really. And you later mentioned about one of the main lessons that you learned was to not get too caught up and swept away in the beginning and setting out too hard a pace. On reflection, would you change anything in the way you started? Do you think you went out a bit hard? People listening, just talk through what that first few hundred miles was like.
One of the pieces of advice that you're offered by everyone, don't get caught up in the excitement. Don't go out too hard on day one because it's a long event. However, you've got all this nervous energy, so it just happens. You end up going quicker than you normally do. And I had planned to cycle about 165 miles per day. We had started at 6 o'clock in the morning. By that evening, it was a place called Mackenzie's Pass. I was at the foot of it, and that was 240 miles into the event. So clearly I had ignored all the advice I'd been given. But I didn't feel overtired, but it was pitch black, and it was about 0 degrees outside. I had no accommodation booked. I had my bivvy bag. It would keep me warm enough, but it didn't offer much in the way of comfort. And I spoke to one of the other racers, a chap called Ryan Flynn, who had done well in the similar type race across the bottom of Australia. And he suggested, well, what you could do, or what we could do, is cycle through the night, get to the little town, and we could get accommodation there. I'm thinking, well, I know I've got Mackenzie Pass to go over. I've no idea what height it is, but I know I've got to go over it. That sounds like quite a good idea. I feel well enough. So I set off to cycle up this pass, which wasn't over big, but it was about, from where I was, I had about the height of Ben Nevis to climb up, get over this pass. But as I got to the top, the sun was rising, and Mackenzie Pass is like lava fields. And it was just an incredible experience. So I suppose there was a degree of tiredness, but the sense of achievement of getting this far, I don't know how far I'd be. I'd be close to the 300 miles by then.
Wow.
The sun. And I just thought, this trip has been worth it. If this is all I experience, I'm happy. So I wasn't too worried if I had destroyed myself. But I got to the town of Sisters, which was on the other side, and I arrived about 6 o'clock in the morning, went into a cafe, and that was when I found out about the never-ending coffee mugs in America. When you're sitting having your breakfast, they just walk around and keep topping up the coffee, keep topping up the coffee. So when I came out, I was wired. I couldn't look for accommodation. I was just awake. So I kept on cycling. And in that first stint, I think I did about 440 miles in that region before I came to a hostel where I stopped. In many ways, it was naive, slightly dangerous in as much as I could have destroyed my whole race. I wouldn't change it again. Your question, would I change it? No, I wouldn't change it. But if I was doing the race again, I wouldn't plan on doing it that way. I would adopt a much more sensible approach to maintain my strength. So I wouldn't change what I did, but I would do it differently in future.
In the future, that's a good answer. So for people that don't know, there's roughly, I think it was about 130 riders that started out, and the entire route itself is about 4,300 miles. Just to give some sense of perspective,
yes,
if you can even imagine 4,300 miles, which I can't, the fact that you've already eaten 400 miles straight on the first day is incredible. So obviously we could go day by day, but just roughly over that period of the next couple of weeks, how did things pan out? Did you come close at any point thinking, I am shattered, I don't think I'm going to complete this? Or did things always feel like it was possible?
It always felt like it was possible. This being my first event, it always felt fantastic. It just felt so good to be doing what I was doing. But there were times I was exhausted, but never did I think I couldn't do it. That never entered into it. It just seemed like a really big challenge, and the enormity of it becomes apparent just as the days go on. It's just an enormous place, and you're doing really big miles every day for a week, 2 weeks, and you've still got another week, 2 weeks to go. So the enormity of it becomes apparent, but you get into a groove. My accommodation issues that I never sorted on day one, that was a really valuable lesson, because from then on, in the afternoon, late afternoon, I would start to think, okay, where am I going to get accommodation, motel? Am I going to bivvy? Is there a hostel? How am I going to do it? So I never ever thought that would give in. There's times that my heart sank, like when you get a puncture in the middle of nowhere and you've got no help, nothing, your heart sinks, but then you fix a puncture and you're back on the bike and away you go again. It's a great experience. And you said that you couldn't comprehend doing 4,300 miles. But the great thing about this sport is it is actually achievable by a whole range of people. The people at the front are true athletes. They're incredible. They're doing in excess of 240 miles a day every day. It's just awesome what they do. But then at the other end of it, you might have someone that's 50, 60 days. They're more getting closer to touring than it is to racing, but they're still doing the event. So I think the sport is incredibly open to everyone, and most people could do it. I think it just needs a change of mindset about I'm here for the long haul type thing.
Yeah. You stayed in we speak about you then staying overnight at places. You stayed in a vast array of different places. One of which I wanted to ask you about was you stayed in a fire station overnight. Was that because of your own fire service connections, or was that just coincidence that you stayed in a fire station one night?
It was coincidence. I took lots of photographs of fire stations as I went past because of my background.
Yeah. But
this was a fire station, Utica is where it was. The route of the Transamerican bike race is a national route. So it's a bit like Sustrans have the national route. So the race follows one of these routes. So all year round, they have tourers that go through their town. And the fire station is open to everybody. It's an incredible setup.
Wow.
The trust that they have for bike packers, tourists just going through their town, you're just allowed to stay on the fire station. And there's a couple of mattresses there that you can use. There's showers. It's a really good setup. It's really impressive.
I just wondered if you'd pulled some strings because you knew someone somewhere in America through your connections, and that. But no, it was just a.
It's a nice thought, but no. I was just some grubby cyclist that was passing through like so many others.
I think your Scottish actually isn't particularly harsh. It's quite a. I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like a slightly poetic Scottish. It's got a nice smoothness to it. Was there ever any querying from Americans with your accent? Do they try and work out where you are? Because I don't know that they would necessarily immediately go, oh, that's a Scottish accent. They might be a little bit thrown off by it.
I had quite a lot of Irish. They would say, are you Irish? Because the Americans were so keen to find out what you were doing. So yes, my accent was hard for them to pin down, but I was received so well. Every single location I went to, I was just treated. I don't know, I think in the UK, when sometimes some of the Americans we come across on holiday could be loud or brash, some of them. When you hear the news about what's going on in America, you don't know how you're going to be treated, but it was just superb. And I put that down, like sometimes I would be in the petrol station, because that's where we would get most of your food from, was service stations, because that's about all you came across very often.
Yeah.
And you would get the equivalent of a Hell's Angel, dressed up with a leather jacket, this big Harley Davidson type bike. And they would come across and all they wanted to know was, where are you going, what you do, what's the bike? And then they would start telling me about, I've got an old steel bike that I weld here and do this. And I was just welcomed with open arms. And that applies in many ways to every single person that took part in that race. Everybody was made to feel welcome. It was superb.
And I think there's clearly that you're treated as beyond a tourist even. You sort of almost elevated to this slightly special position. I think for someone to be cycling through the middle of their own country, I think might be quite a proud thing. And I think people would certainly appreciate that. There's absolutely a shtick or an idea out there at the moment, particularly at the moment with America. But the reality is that the culture of America, probably the thing that I most enjoy about it. I've been there twice. I've been fortunate. I'd love to go again, but only twice so far. And my main experience was just there's just less barrier. There's less wall to strangers. That they are on average far more confident to just tell it to you straight or ask you exactly what they want to know. And then you quickly find out that for me, that's a culture that I quite like. That works well because, there's no hiding away from it. There's no shyness. There is a brashness, but it works so beautifully when it comes to being in their own country. And I'm sure you experience a lot of that. They'll just ask you questions, whereas in England, perhaps we might shy away a bit more and be a little more conservative.
I loved it. Quite a few times I would find myself going into cafes in the morning. Because it was mainly small town America you go through, there's smaller towns. In these cafes, 6 o'clock in the morning, it's rammed and everybody seems to know each other. It was almost like an English country pub where everybody knows each other in the pub. So they're all talking. You walk in, everybody looks, thinks, who's that? But they don't hang back. Like you say, they soon ask you what you're doing and everything. And before you know, you're part of this big group. They're telling you all about their life, and which is different to anything I had experienced. And certainly my experience, they loved the fact that I was taking the time to go through the smaller areas. And I think a lot of them wanted to do exactly the same, but it was something that would be on their bucket list to travel across America, visit all these small towns. So they appreciated that you were taking the time to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. With the Transamerican bike race, there are obviously a number of dangers, which anyone who begins thinking about this would start to surmise there might be some things. But there's also things you would never think of. The main sort of three that I pulled out were there's certainly been circumstances where riders have actually been killed by cars and vehicles in general. You can imagine just the sheer amount of time spent on the road. Statistically, there's a chance that is, of course, going to happen.
Yes.
The other two were dogs chasing you, which you had some experience with. And then you even had a story about about deer as well, and even a friend of yours, a second time not completing this race because he was taken out by a deer. How aware were you of them before starting, and how much did it become apparent once you started riding?
Through my research, I knew that dogs were an issue, and I'll talk about them just in a little bit, but dogs were a big issue. I was aware of that. So before I went, I had rabies injections. And the other animal that I was acutely aware of was bears, because bears are, particularly in Yellowstone, you can expect that you may well encounter a bear. But the other animals, and I knew a little bit about snakes being a risk, but I wasn't over concerned about that. But the deer it's just like the UK, it was a bit of a freak accident, but you're cycling out in the countryside, and especially at dusk, the deer are about. And yes, one of my friends was taken out by a deer hitting him on a bike, just trying to jump in front of him, but got it wrong and hit him. And sadly, he had pulled out the year before because of problems he had a tooth abscess or something. So he had to pull out. In many ways, luck plays quite a big part in getting across America. You can't stop deer hitting you if they just appear out of nowhere. There's nothing much you can do to protect yourself from that. But the dogs appear in Kentucky. That's where they're famed in the long distance cycling world. Kentucky is a nightmare for the dogs. But either side of that, you get them as well a little bit. But the dogs, they act like wild dogs, but they're not wild dogs. They're usually guard dogs for the houses, but the houses come down to the roadway and there's no fences. So when these dogs see you cycling past, they love it. So I must have experienced 50 dog chases. And these are the dogs are intent on getting you. The previous year in the race, the year before I did it, the 3 front runners, the 3 fastest people, were all bitten by the same pit bull terrier. So it is a real issue that you've got to be aware of. Lots of people do different things. Some people carry bear spray, pepper spray. Some people have a stick, some people have a knife. I opted for a whistle because I'd been told that whistles are useful, and I wasn't that confident. So the first few dog chases, it was just an adrenaline-fueled chase to get away from them, a sprint, which fortunately I won. Then I had a night where it was dark, we're heading into the night time, pitch black, I'm on my own, there's not an awful lot of traffic about, and I'm sure I was getting chased by about 4 or 5 dogs, and it was rolling countryside, and that was scary. That concerned me a lot. And I thought, I must start trying this whistle. And to my surprise, it actually worked. So as the dogs come towards you, you don't speed up, you don't slow down, keep going at whatever speed you're going, wait till they get close, look them in the eye, and then blow this whistle. And sure enough, it doesn't scare them, but you could see them stopping thinking, what on earth is that? Or I wonder if they think, are there reinforcements coming or something? But it concerns them enough to stop, look around, and then that just breaks the chase. I'm not good with dogs. I was worried about Kentucky. That was one of the things that worried me. Could I get through Kentucky with all these dog chases? But by the time I came out the other side of Kentucky, I was actually really confident with the whistle and the dogs, and it transformed my experience. So I'm actually better with dogs now, having gone through that experience.
Oh, that's interesting.
But I would recommend a whistle. And like runners are plagued by dogs. At least on a bike, you've got a chance of going faster than them. For runners, I don't know how some runners cope with the dogs, but
I think I'd be pepper spraying at that point because, I'm not sure, as confident as I am in my running ability, pack of dogs, nope, that's not happening.
In Kentucky's favour, I would not want anyone from Kentucky to think that I'm speaking badly of their state, because in Kentucky, the drivers were so polite. And then a lot of the youngsters in Kentucky would drive up alongside me, wind down the window and shout, way to go, or whatever they were shouting in America. Really supportive. It was very positive in Kentucky. I liked it a lot. It was good. And the dogs, once I'd managed them, I was happy.
Yeah. And it must be fascinating cycling through the middle of America. You know, the image, sort of the Hollywood image, if you like, is New York City, and then you get the kind of sunshine coast type places, beaches and sea. But a lot of the time, I think middle America is left out, and it's more of an unknown. So I think to really throw yourself into, as you mentioned, sort of that little town America side of things, and have the coffee refilled, and have people look around and wonder who the guy is with the bike in the cafe. I think that's a very eye-opening experience. Probably something that people don't get to do very much. Many people who have been on holiday to America, yeah, I've been to California, yeah, I've been to New York or whatever, or when you ask them, or yeah, I've been to Philadelphia or Florida, to Disney World, but perhaps they're not getting the full American experience by not going right into that central point of the country.
That's one thing that cycling allows you to do, is to actually, as there's running, you actually get to experience the countryside that you're going through. And it was different. There were some very moneyed areas. There was some poverty that you could see. You know, you were going some areas that were struggling, that were quite derelict, but never did the welcome change. You know, the scenery and the conditions they lived in maybe changed, but regardless of that, it was always welcoming. You would see a lot of neon lights, but it would actually be the churches that had big neon lights flashing, you know,
wow,
with their messages. One of my happiest, if not the happiest memory I have of America, I was coming down from Colorado into Kansas, so I'm near the border. So you're coming out the big mountains, and suddenly it's big flat plains. There were strong winds that day, so a lot of side winds. It was getting close to 40 degrees, so I'm getting baked on the road. The winds are battering me. And on this horizon, I could see this little garage, and it reminded me of some of the Western movies because it was rusty. It looked derelict. You could hear the signs swinging in the wind. But I thought, I've got to go in, because if it's open, I'm in there. And sure enough, it was open. And when I went inside, it was like stepping back in time. And the couple that owned it, one of them was sitting on the sofa with one of the other racers. And they just said, I'll come in, sit down, have a Coke. And for 20 minutes, we just chatted. Nothing happened. There is nothing special about the moment, but it was just an awesome experience. And it's hard to explain what was good about it, but it's something that I'll never ever be able to repeat. That step back in time, and the warmth of the welcome, and just how relaxed it was. So for 20 minutes, I stepped out the baking sunshine, back into it again, and the race continued. It was just like pausing for 20 minutes, you know, pressing the pause button for 20 minutes, and then back on I went. So America, and small town America, loved it. I would highly recommend, if you get the chance, to wander off the beaten track, you know, away from Florida, away from New York. It's a different place, and in some ways it's a better place in some ways.
And if we fast forward slightly to the final couple of days of the race, a big question, what was the experience like as you were coming in? What was the overriding emotion? Did you feel a huge sense of achievement? Were you actually quite sad that it was coming to an end because it was this very unique experience? What did you feel like in those last couple of days, those last couple of 100 miles?
The last few 100 miles, it was a different experience for me. This race had been about pushing myself to my limits, going as far as I could. Some days I did 75 miles, some days I'd be over 200 miles. I was doing better than I had expected. So with about 3 days worth of cycling to go, you're able to follow it online, so you know who's in front of you and you know where they are. So there was one chap that was older than me, because I had done this when I was 60. So there was one chap that was older than me, and he was about 50 miles in front of me. And I thought, I wonder if I can beat him. It was a challenge to myself. I wanted to see if I could be, you know, no one older than me beats me type thing. I thought, that would be a really good challenge. So whilst I had been really relaxed about the whole thing, it was only about completion. I thought, that would be a nice target. So the last 3 days turned into a race for me to see if I could get ahead. So in the first of those last 3 days, I decided that I would have to get within 10 miles of him to stand any chance of making the time up. But the towns are so spread out that I actually ended up, I had to have a extra long cycle that day and ended up in a place called Withyville, where there was about 7 or 8 riders, I think, had already stopped way ahead of me. So I'd caught up with them. So we're all in this same town, all in different hotels spread across. I got up, I'd only had a few hours sleep, and I thought, right, 2 days worth of cycling to go. I think it was 440 miles. Let's see if I could do this in a 1 hour. Let's push. So I don't know how competitive you are, but it just changed it. I just thought, I'm going to go for this, see if I can do it. I pushed on that day with the intention of cycling through the night to get this 440 miles done. So I set off quite early, and sure enough, I managed to keep going, but it was difficult because at one point I'd started to have some slight hallucinations.
I was going to
and
ask.
It's hard to explain. Yeah. They're not full-on hallucinations. If I wind back to the start of the interview, when I was talking about Race Across America, some of those guys hallucinate, and their team members are saying the monsters are coming to get you. So they use them to make their cyclists go faster. But my hallucinations were quite timid. They were, as I looked up the road, I kept seeing people standing waiting. And as I got closer, I would realise that it was just a post box. You know, these post box that the American have that's at the end of the road? And if they had a sticker on it, sometimes I think, they're wearing a high-vis jacket up ahead. Who's that? Wow. And all these times, it was just mild hallucinations. I suppose your brain's trying to cope with all this information and it's tired. So what I did was I decided, right, I'm going to stop and try and have a sleep because I didn't want to be dangerous. I promised my family that I wouldn't do anything dangerous because the event is dangerous enough. So I stopped at a picnic bench beside this lake, set my alarm for 15 minutes. Thought, we'll try a micro sleep, see if it helped. And I woke up with a start thinking, how long have I been sleeping? I really thought I'd overslept. And I'd only slept for 10 minutes. So I thought, okay, we'll try that. Got another mile or two down the road, came across a garage. And so for the first time in my life, really, I had Red Bull, the energy drinks, the coffee, the food, everything I could. And that was enough to sustain me all the way to the end. So with those last 3 days being turned into a race, it made it really special and achieved what I'd set out to do. Ironically, because I had managed to keep going through the night, all the people that were ahead of me, or many of the people that were ahead of me, that had started off in Withyville, where my kind of 48-hour stint started, most of them had had to stop. So I suddenly moved up the rankings so that I actually finished in quite a high place, way higher than I ever expected.
Yeah,
so
of course. Good. Yeah, I had you down as finishing in 10th place. That must have been a very pleasant surprise. And in total, it took you 22 days and 8 hours, which is, it's one of those things you can't really, you tell that to someone, they go, is that good? What? That sounds like a huge amount of time. But then you just go, well, it was across America. I mean, it's such it sort of moves into this strange outer realm. People understand marathon times, 5K times, etc. And then 10-mile time trial on a bike, for example, people have a good concept. If they're in that kind of scene, they know what good times are. But when you say cycle across America and you say, so what's a good time for that? People be like, it's a hard.
It's really difficult. The fastest times were generally about 17 days, but last year a chap did it in 16 days. I don't know how many hours, 20 hours or something, but he got below the 17 days mark. So that's a really fast one. It was won by a woman called Leah Wilcox. I can't remember which year, but she had an awesome win. She, like me, had been chasing someone, got to the final day. As she got up early hours in the morning, because you tend to get up, you're on the road 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. She saw a light coming towards her. The chap who had been 20, 30, 40 miles in front of her had cycled the wrong way. He was actually coming back down the course.
No.
Leo stopped him and spoke to him. So I think they cycled for a little bit together. And I think he offered, shall we finish this together? And they said, no, I've been chasing you for weeks now. It's a race. If you want to, you head up the road, sprint away, beat me. But she pushed on and she won it, which was quite awesome, I thought. But it's a really special sport. So you have the people that do it in 17 days. You have the people that do it in 50 days. You have a lot of people that do it in the 20-day, between 20 and 30 days. There's quite a lot of people. What I'm pleased about is it annoyed my family because I used to say, I'm surrounded by these really good cyclists. I don't know what I'm doing here. But all these cyclists, they were really fast. They were brilliant cyclists. They would be fast. They would come up behind me. We would chat and then they would shoot off in front of me. Hours later, they would cycle up behind me, chat, and then shoot off. And I'm thinking, how come these guys aren't like disappearing down the road? But it's just everyone's different. I definitely was the slow, steady, keep going. I can keep going. And that's what I say. I'm genuinely an ordinary cyclist, but I can keep going. Whereas lots of these people were gifted cyclists so fast. I'm so impressed with the people that I met, the company I kept. They were so fast, so friendly. And I think if you turn up at these events, that's where you get the respect. It doesn't really matter what your time is. People appreciate the fact that you've
just showing up.
Yeah, you've showed up, you've made an effort, and for most of us, or for many of us, we get to the end.
One of the things I wanted to touch on, Brian, as we start to wrap up now, having heard about this incredible adventure of yours and just the general experiences, was you did the Transamerican bike race at the age of 60. Do you feel like you retired from the fire service in 2010? Do you feel like retirement has played a big role in you being able to now do these grand adventures, or do you think there's any element of you that possibly just wouldn't have even done this, thought of doing this when you were 30, and it's more a case of wanting to just, without trying to sound too poetic, but just get the most out of life and do these experiences? Has your mindset shifted much over the years and these adventures, or have you always wanted to do big things?
And that's a great question. I've always wanted to push myself, and I suppose that's why in the early 80s I was doing the marathons. And I don't think I'd ever heard of ultra distance running, or that might have appealed to me at the time. So I always like to push myself. But with the fire service, I had a great career. I started in 1980 as a young firefighter and managed to end up traveling around the country. And I ended up as a chief officer. I then retired. And back in 2015, I managed to join as a firefighter. I was able to do something I loved. Get back on the fire engine. So exciting. I started at the bottom, got to the top, but when the opportunity came to do the really exciting, rewarding part of the job, it was just, I couldn't resist it. So I did that. So retirement has given me lots of opportunities. I've always had the desire for the adventure, but life has, with work, with children, the opportunities are less, with money as well as that. I appreciate that to do something like the Transamerican, it is a real privilege because you have to have the time to do it. You have to have the finances to get out there, to have the bike that's suitable to do it, to have the kit, spend so much time in a country and provide your accommodation. It's a real privilege to be able to do it, but it is just all about adventure. And retirement does open up different avenues. I never see it as closing down anything. Like as I get older, you end up with different goals. Some of that's only possible because I'm retired. So I love the question about, has it made it easier being retired? I never think about it as that being the key factor, but it's more to do with opportunity. But it is a big factor. You're right. It is a big factor.
When you, obviously, I'm a bit younger, so I'm always fascinated in this to ask someone who's just wiser than me and has lived more than I have. But when you pass 60, is there any kind of shift mentally of, in 20 years, I'm going to be the ripe old age of 80? That's not something people don't tend to do, cycling across countries or these grand events at that kind of age. And at 60, I think culturally we're sometimes guilty of calling older age far too early, when actually when you see people who really dedicate themselves and apply themselves mentally and physically, you can do a hell of a lot till quite late in life. And at 60, people are very, very able-bodied if they've been quite lucky, but certainly if they've looked after themselves. Is there an element of knowing that, like, for example, when you wanted to enter the Transamerican, Did you feel like, well, if I don't do it now, I can't sit on this for 15 years and then think at 75, yeah, now I'll have a go. Is there a sort of a slight ticking clock?
Age is fascinating. I liked the fact that I was doing it when I was 60. I thought that would be an achievement. But as soon as it's done, you're then thinking, okay, I wonder how fast will I be if I try and do it when I'm 65 or 70? I would love to do it again. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, will I be that much slower, or will I be able to put the work in to actually keep the time fairly close to it, or even better if it's a miracle type thing? But I don't think you worry about 20 years down the line. You actually just think of new challenges. What's fascinating is a challenge when you're older might not be a challenge when you're younger. It's a bit like the fire service. In the fire service, we do fitness testing. They have the bleep test. Well, the bleep test, the pass mark, when you're in your 20s, you're actually quite ordinary if you can pass the target. Once you get to 60, to actually pass the target, the same target, is actually quite an achievement. You know, you fall into the exceptional, maybe not exceptional category, but very good category. So I think getting older, I think you always set yourself goals and your adventures change, you know, but you always set yourself goals. You're not any different. You're still looking for adventure. You're still looking for challenges. It's just that they're different challenges from when you're 20.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's definitely that element. Even my own dad, Steve, you know, for him, when he's sort of doing his 5K stuff, he focuses a lot on his age category and trying to get his age grading, his percentage up when it comes through. And because you're right, it kind of challenges come out of new places, and exactly to do that time at that age compared to that age is a totally different ball game and requires totally different commitment, and in fact is far more impressive.
In many ways it's still the same challenge. You're still just trying to push yourself as hard as you can. I use the Strava. I have a look at the age things when you're looking at segments and things. It's just a good way of pushing it.
It's an interesting I find sort of age and physical ability and challenges and all that kind of stuff and opportunities very interesting. I see a lot of my friends get very swept up in careers and all sorts you talked about, and I've seen many people, my own parents have some friends who they put some photos up the other day online. They just bought this huge camper van and they're like going around and traveling and going around the country and doing all these incredible things. But the guy who has the camper van, yes, is now financially very stable and has all these great things. But he also, he's very old and he's got all these, heart condition and lungs and all these issues. And there's that part of me that thinks, do I really want to work that hard for so long whilst being this young and able? To then, yes, have the financial freedom and the free time and be retired, but also then have, having to pop down the hospital every 2 weeks to get my medication for some disease I've got. Do you know what I mean? So I'd rather be healthy and fit than go too crazy with it. But that's a whole other subject. On the subject of career, I think one of the final questions I had for you, Brian, actually was, you certainly have an attitude of someone who's, I think, very positive, very open-minded, and certainly very determined. You had a fantastic quote where you'd written down, discipline makes the daring possible, which I found quite interesting. Do you think that the fire service has, first of all, helped with that discipline and making you organised to sort of prioritise and do these big adventures like the Transamerican bike race that do require a lot of discipline to do? You must have seen some incredible things, whether that be cutting people out of cars, road accidents, fires, all sorts. Does that give you a good perspective? Does that give you a healthy outlook, do you think?
My fire service experience has certainly shaped me. As a firefighter, I have seen some things that perhaps people shouldn't see, people jumping from buildings and various other things. But I think the experience of turning up at an emergency when everyone is looking to you to be the calm one, there is a degree that what it does is it knocks the highs and lows off of things so that you're much steadier. You still have the highs and lows, but it's in a smaller band. And I think that's certainly good for the bike packing, because sometimes you find yourself in situations that are pretty desperate. Your bike looks like it's failing, you're in the middle of nowhere. How are you going to cope with it?
There's a dog chewing on your leg.
Dog chewing on your leg. But you tend not to view it as, you try not to be over dramatic. And so you never have the deep concerns, but sometimes you don't have the deep highs because you're much more controlled. So the fire service definitely had an impact because I've lived my life like that, dealing with things. And sometimes I wish I did have the highs and the lows, but I just find Whether it's me or whether it's what the fire service has bred into me, I don't know, but sometimes I wish I could be higher and accept the lowers, whereas I just tend to be, no, that's fine, I can cope with that, or, either good or bad. You lose a little bit of the excitement, but it saves you from the depths of concern in some situations.
There's definitely an element of biology and personality in that. I've found that some of the things I've done, that I'm probably quite similar to that. I don't tend to get particularly emotional one way or the other on subjects, particularly in later years as I've got a little bit more mature now. Generally stay within the same bracket compared to, take my mum or my sister, both much more highs and lows. The swing is much greater. And I think sometimes, as much as you can see a negative in that, I do wonder sometimes, you do kind of think, am I missing out on the experience here? You're reacting, you've been handed this present at Christmas and you're reacting so strongly to it, and I just can't feel that strongly. But then what it allows us to do is to do create, like, for my birthday I went coasteering. We were jumping in off cliffs into, choppy seas, and I had to do that to kind of feel sort of a bit of excitement and go, yeah, this is fun.
Yes.
Whereas that would be terrifying for them. So it allows you to do these big things and these huge challenges, and maybe someone who was less level-headed and had a wider band, they might struggle to do something as big as the Transamerican bike race.
Yeah.
Well, Brian, I really appreciate you coming on and having a chat with me. It's a fascinating story. I think it's always interesting to get someone on to talk about a particular event they've done, that's something that's very few people in this world have ever done. The Transamerican Bike Race is an incredible event. I hope that if you ever do decide to do it again, it'd be fascinating to follow your adventures again, or certainly on any other bike race you do. And just amazing career in the fire service, and I think that's probably done a lot for some of the experiences you've had. I just want to thank you for coming on and talking to me and sharing your story. I hope at some point maybe we can go for a jog, or perhaps even a bike ride together.
Yes.
But anything over 50 miles might scare me, but we can try it.
That'd be really good. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Jog On. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do and you'd like to help Jog On grow, you can share this episode with a friend. This and other podcast episodes are also available in video format. You can go to the YouTube channel Jog On Podcast with Harry Morgan, or if you'd like to see some of the main videos that we create on Jog On themed around running, you can go to YouTube as well and search for the channel Jog On with Harry Morgan. To buy a Jog On top, email a size request to thisisjogon@gmail.com. I'm Harry Morgan. Go for that run. And this is Jog On.